Today is September 26, 2022. I want to talk about the situation in Iran. We're hearing a lot about this deadly violence in Iran. We're listening to the Western media telling us this is about social justice, this is about women's rights, and immediately people should be very suspicious about all of this. And I'm going to walk you through on why, in case you don't already know. Let's check out this BBC article to see what the Western media is saying. Iran protests. Mahsa Amini's death puts morality police under spotlight. This is what the BBC says. The death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, after she was detained by Iran's so-called morality police, has sparked angry protests, with women burning their headscarves and a defiant act of resistance against the Islamic Republic's strict dress code and those enforcing it. So the BBC is pretending that these protests spread nationwide, extremely violent, very, very large scale. It's all spontaneous, organic, and it's all in response to this single incident. The story of which has now changed several times. They were claiming that the police beat this woman to death. The Iranian police released the CCTV footage. She fell down. She had a heart attack. She had some kind of health problem, and she fell down in the middle of the police station, supposedly. This is what I saw. I have not seen any evidence provided by the Western media or these opposition groups that she was beaten to death. The BBC article goes on for paragraphs and paragraphs all about women's rights, and this is all nonsense. The BBC doesn't care about women's rights. The UK does not care about women's rights. The EU does not care about women's rights, especially when it comes to women picking and choosing what they can and cannot wear, because they do the exact same thing in Europe. So I just want to point out this hypocrisy here. This is from Time magazine. Who gets to wear a headscarf? The complicated history behind France's latest hijab controversy. And it goes on and it says, the head of French President Emmanuel Macron's political party withdrew support late last week for one of the party's own candidates after she wore a headscarf in a campaign poster. The conflict over the women's choice of head cover comes in the wake of controversy surrounding an amendment passed by the French Senate last month that would ban girls under 18 from wearing the hijab in public. As part of a proposed anti-separatism bill, it was presented alongside amendments that would also prevent mothers from wearing hijabs on their children's school trips and would ban the burkini, a full-body swimsuit. So this is Europe doing exactly what Iran is doing, telling women how they can and cannot dress. So it's obviously not about that. It's obviously about regime change, and this is just a pretext used by the West to prey on people's emotions and ignorance. And let's continue. Look at this Washington Post article. Death to the dictator. Videos show growing protests in Iran. So that's what it was about from the very beginning. It was about US-sponsored regime change. They just needed some kind of pretext to get it all going. So this is a very appealing story, especially for the West. A lot of people in the West prioritize these types of stories, oblivious to the hypocrisy within their own societies in regards to women's rights. But they do love preaching to other countries and cultures they see as backwards. And so this is just a narrative. The Washington Post says the protest started small outside the Tehran hospital, where a 22-year-old Iranian woman died last week after being detained by the morality police for an untold violation of the country's harsh strictures on women's dress. Well, okay, what about France? They have the same type of harsh strictures on women's dress. By Tuesday, the protests were racing across the country in a burst of grief, anger, and defiance. Well, protests don't just spontaneously spread. They don't. They require leadership, organization, money, supplies. So who's behind all of this? Well, we'll find out real soon. Many were led by women who burned their headscarves, cut their hair, and chanted death to the dictator. So almost immediate, almost instantly. Actually, really, from the very beginning, this was all about regime change. It's a regime change mob organized, led, and pushed by US-backed opposition groups. The article continues, the ferocity of the protests is fueled by outrage over many things at once. The allegations that Amini was beaten in custody before she collapsed and fell into a coma. Notice they talk about allegations. They don't talk about any evidence about it being true because they are fully aware that there is CCTV that contradicts that claim, and they don't want to talk about it because they want you to just jump to the conclusion yourself that that is true. That this is what the Western media always does. The priorities of Iran's government, led by ultra-conservative president who has strictly enforced dress codes and empowered the hated morality police at a time of widespread economic suffering. Why is Iran's economy suffering? Because of Western sanctions. That's why, specifically to help fuel unrest and instability in the country. This is the whole reason they are doing that. The anguish of Amani's family, ethnic Kurds from a rural area of Iran, whose expressions of pain and shock have resonated across the country. So they're talking about Kurds, and we all should be familiar with this ethnic group, the Kurds. Their population spans Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and the United States uses Kurds as proxies in every single one of these countries against the governments in each one of these countries. They have encouraged separatism among the Kurds in Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. And even though Turkey is supposedly a NATO member and supposed to be some kind of ally, at least on some level, of Washington's, they use this issue with the Kurds to constantly keep Turkey under pressure, to keep them in line, so to speak. Now look how quickly the United States inserted itself in this, almost as if it was planned from the beginning. This is from Reuters. U.S. puts sanctions on Iran morality police, accusing unit of abusing women. The United States on Thursday imposed sanctions on Iran's morality police over allegations of abuse of Iranian women, saying it held the unit responsible for the death of a 22-year-old in custody that has sparked protests around Iran. The U.S. Treasury Department also accused the morality police of violating the rights of peaceful protesters and said it had imposed sanctions on 7 senior Iranian military and security officials, including the chief of the Iranian army's ground forces. Well, this is, again, just mounting sanctions upon sanctions on Iran over the course of decades, preceding this by decades. This is all the U.S. has done in an attempt to weaken, undermine, divide, and destroy Iranian society, topple the government, put a client regime in place, or just split Iran up into multiple failed states. That's what this is about. This is the United States inserting itself immediately into this unrest, which should be highly suspicious for everyone. Now, is this just me understanding that the U.S. in general lies about everything, and I'm just assuming that they're lying about this, and I'm just taking a contrarian point of view? No, this is not me doing that. This is me being very well aware of, again, decades of U.S. foreign policy in regards to Iran, reading through the policy papers that have then been implemented as U.S. foreign policy over the years, including this paper from the Brookings Institution, which is funded by the U.S. government and the largest, most powerful corporate financier interest across the West. This paper is titled, "Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Toward Iran." It was published in 2009, and literally every single option discussed in this paper has been implemented in one form or another, with varying degrees of success. And let me just read off some of the chapters. These are the literal titles of the chapters in this Brookings paper. Going all the way, invasion. The Asarak option, airstrikes. Leave it to Bibi, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. Now listen to these two very carefully. The Velvet Revolution, supporting a popular uprising. Almost seems like that's what they're doing today, isn't it? Inspiring an insurgency, supporting Iranian minority and opposition groups. So actually, when you think about it, it's a little bit of both, isn't it? It's a Velvet Revolution and an insurgency in the making. That's what they're doing right now in Iran. And they're talking about Iranian minority and opposition groups. Well, the article that I was just reading from, Reuters, they were just talking about the Kurds, weren't they? Other chapters include the coup, supporting a military move against the regime, accepting the unacceptable, containment, and then finally, crafting an integrated Iran policy, connecting the options. So what did I just say about there being elements of at least two of those suggestions? Well, that they're talking about implementing them together to create synergies. That's exactly what they talk about in this paper. Now, let's look a little closer to these two chapters, the supporting a popular uprising and inspiring an insurgency. Let's look at the Velvet Revolution supporting a popular uprising. Let's see what the Brookings Institution said in 2009. Let's read. Because the Iranian regime is widely disliked by many Iranians, the most obvious and palatable method of bringing about its demise would be to help foster a popular revolution along the lines of the Velvet Revolutions that toppled many communist governments in Eastern Europe beginning in 1989. And the US was involved in every single one of those. Those were not they're not popular uprisings if a foreign government is organizing them. Let's be clear about that. It continues, for many proponents of regime change, it seems self-evident that the United States should encourage the Iranian people to take power in their own name, and that this would be the most legitimate method of regime change. After all, what Iranian or foreigner could object to helping the Iranian people fulfill their own desires? But then the paper completely contradicts that sentiment. That sentiment is for public consumption only. They reveal the true nature of this option, that it is using the Iranian people at their expense to do what the US wants for US interests. They don't care about Iranian interests. They don't care about the Iranian people. They're just using them. And this is what the Brookings Institution says. The true objective, the truth about this, of this policy option is to overthrow the clerical regime in Tehran and see it replaced, hopefully by one whose views would be more compatible with US interests in the region. They don't care about the Iranian people's interests. They care about buttressing US interests in the region. The policy does, in its own way, seek a change in Iranian behavior, but by eliminating the government that is responsible for that behavior without the use of American military forces, so that they could get mobs to burn down Iranian infrastructure. It's just as good as if they came in and bombed it themselves, only they're doing it with Iranian people shedding their blood in the process, and the US military not even having to get involved in the first place. Same outcome, just a different means to arrive at it. That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about helping the Iranian people. Again, they're talking about using the Iranian people at their own expense to advance US interests, not their interests. And when you think about this policy, it is a complete violation of international law. It is a violation of the UN Charter. It's a violation of Iran's sovereignty. You're interfering in the internal political affairs of Iran by backing violent subversion. That's exactly what you're doing. This is something the US would complain about other countries doing. This is something that they're openly planning to do to another country. The paper also says, this is very interesting, while the ultimate goal is to remove the regime, working with the internal opposition also could be a form of coercive pressure on the Iranian regime, giving the United States leverage on other issues. So even if regime change is impossible, you're still pressuring and also punishing the Iranian government. Why is the US at this juncture attempting to punish the Iranian government? Well, Iran has been in the news lately because of its supposed support of Russia. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests they did indeed send hundreds, if not thousands, of drones to Russia for use in Ukraine against the US proxy war against Russia there. And so very predictably, the US is going to try to make Iran pay a price for that. They're going to try to pressure and coerce them to stop supporting Russia. And if that doesn't work, they'll just continue putting pressure on Iran until in their mind, they could topple the government. That would solve the problem for good, wouldn't it? Now, what about the US's role in supporting these mobs? We just saw the US involve itself by sanctioning different groups inside Iran because of these most recent protests and unrest. What does the Brookings Institution say about how the U.S. will support these? It says the United States could play multiple roles in facilitating a revolution. By funding and helping organize domestic rivals of the regime, the United States could create an alternative leadership to seize power. Yes, they do this in every single country. That's what the National Endowment for Democracy does. They have programs in almost every country on earth. They are funding an opposition that serves U.S. interests, and they try to maneuver them into power so that the country stops serving the interests of the people living there and starts serving the interests of Washington and Wall Street. As Raymond Tainter of the Iran Policy Committee argues, students and other groups need covert backing for their demonstrations. They need fax machines, they need internet access, funds to duplicate materials, and funds to keep vigilantes from beating them up. Beyond this, US-backed media outlets could highlight regime shortcomings and make otherwise obscure critics more prominent. So the US media isn't informing anyone, they're manipulating the public through disinformation. The United States already supports Persian language satellite television, Voice of America Persian, and Radio Farda. That bring unfiltered news to Iranians. In recent years, they have taken the lion's share of overt U.S. funding for promoting democracy in Iran. U.S. economic pressure and perhaps military pressure as well can discredit the regime, making the population hungry for a rival leadership, and a rival leadership that the U.S. itself creates and directs. So is this really people-powered revolution, or is it just dressed up like that and it's really just U.S.-backed regime change? It's very obvious what that is. So is there any evidence beyond the Brookings Institution suggesting this? Is there any evidence that the U.S. has actually been doing this? Yes, of course there is. Again, all of these sources are from the Western media. This is a Reuters article from 2009. U.S. State Department speaks to Twitter over Iran. And it's no secret that Twitter, Facebook, and Google have worked together with the U.S. State Department to help advance U.S. foreign policy. That's what the whole Arab Spring was from 2011 onward. This is what the article says about this incident in 2009. The U.S. State Department said on Tuesday it had contacted the social networking service Twitter to urge it to delay a planned upgrade that would have cut daytime service to Iranians who are disputing their election. Confirmation that the U.S. government had contacted Twitter came as the Obama administration sought to avoid suggestions it was meddling in Iran's internal affairs, as the Islamic Republic battled to control deadly street protests over the election result. Twitter and Facebook have been used as a tool by many young people to coordinate protests over the election's outcome. Well, they're using them as tools to create upheaval because the U.S. State Department trained them to do that. And to prove this, we have articles like this. This is more recent, 2020, Financial Times. U.S. boosts funding of tech companies to help anti-Tehran protests. So this is an open admission that the U.S. is behind these opposition groups. This is not the Brookings Institution suggesting this. This is also the U.S. government implementing it and the U.S. media admitting it. The U.S. and Western media admitting this. So the Financial Times article says U.S. government-funded technology companies have recorded an increase in the use of circumvention software in Iran in recent weeks after boosting efforts to help Iranian anti-regime protesters thwart internet censorship and use secure mobile messaging. Well, they make this sound like this is about free speech versus censorship, but actually it's about Iran trying to control its information space and the U.S. trying to hijack it. The outreach is part of a U.S. government program dedicated to internet freedom that supports dissident pressure inside Iran and complements America's policy of maximum pressure over the regime. This is literally what the Brookings Institution suggested. So this is the U.S. verbatim implementing it. A U.S. State Department official told the Financial Times that since protests in Iran in 2018, at the time the largest in almost a decade, Washington had accelerated efforts to provide Iranians more options on how they communicate with each other and the outside world. The U.S. supported measures include providing apps, servers, and other technology to help people communicate, visit banned websites, install anti-tracking software, and navigate data shutdowns. Many Iranians rely on virtual private networks, VPNs, that receive U.S. funding or are beamed in with U.S. support, not knowing they are relying on Washington-backed tools. We work with technological companies to help free to help free flow of information and provide circumvention tools that helped in last week's protests, a second U.S. State Department official told the Financial Times. We are able to sponsor VPNs, and that allows Iranians to use the internet. And this is all about exposing Iranians to Western propaganda, providing them Western support, and also influencing the West's public perception as well as the U.S. attempts to overthrow another government in another country, a sovereign country, in violation of international law, in violation of the UN Charter. So that is the Brookings Institution in 2009 suggesting, the U.S. sponsoring an uprising and then the U.S. step-by-step implementing it. Clear as day. What about the chapter titled Inspiring an Insurgency, Supporting Iranian Minority and Opposition Groups? What does the Brookings Institution have to say about that in their 2009 paper? It says, as much as many Americans might like to help the Iranian people rise up and take their destiny in their own hands, which again, this is nonsense. They're using the Iranian people to hijack the country for U.S. interests, not the Iranian people's interests. The evidence suggests that the likelihood is low and that American assistance could well make it less likely rather than more. Consequently, some who favor fomenting regime change in Iran argue that it is utopian to hold out hope for a velvet revolution. Instead, they contend that the United States should turn to Iranian opposition groups that already exist, that already have demonstrated a desire to fight the regime, and who appear willing to accept U.S. assistance. And that is exactly who they're using in Iran right now. The hope behind this course of action is that these various opposition groups could transform themselves into a more potent movement that might be able to overturn the regime. So the opposition groups, the insurgency, this is actually all part of one movement. The protests start out and serve as cover for the armed militant groups to move in and start killing people, which has already started in Iran. The Brookings Institution paper, again, remember, this was written in 2009. It continues. It says, for instance, the United States could opt to work primarily with various unhappy Iranian ethnic groups. And the first one on the list is Kurds. And they also mention Baluch and Arabs, who have fought the regime at various periods since the revolution. A coalition of ethnic opposition movements, particularly if combined with dissident Persians, would pose a serious threat to regime stability. In addition, the unrest the groups themselves create could weaken the regime at home. At the least, the regime would have to divert resources to putting down the rebellions, and then, because they're diverting resources to put down these rebellions, they're not as able to render assistance to Russia, for example. At most, the unrest might discredit the regime over time, weakening its position vis-a-vis its rivals. So again, they were just talking about the Kurds in that Reuters article involved in the unrest right now, and in the 2009 Brookings paper, the first one on the list was Kurds, and it's not because they were listing it in alphabetical order. Now, the paper goes on and it starts talking about a very specific group that they think would be a good candidate for the U.S. to sponsor, arm, and back. And it's called the Mujahideen al-Khaliq, or MEK. And this is what the paper, 2009, remember, this is what the paper says about the MEK. Perhaps the most prominent and certainly the most controversial opposition group that has attracted attention as a potential U.S. proxy. They're just saying it as plain as day. A U.S. proxy, that's what all of this is about. These opposition groups are proxies. They have no agency. They would not exist without U.S. support and direction. They're talking about the NCRI, National Council of Resistance of Iran. It is the political movement established by the MEK. Critics believe the group to be undemocratic and unpopular, and both of those are absolutely true. And indeed, anti-American. Maybe not. They're more than happy to take American assistance, knowing full well it's coming from the United States. In contrast, the group's champions contend that the movement's longstanding opposition to the Iranian regime and record of successful attacks on and intelligence gathering operations against the regime make it worthy of U.S. support, because they don't care if they're funding and arming terrorists. All they care about is the outcome. They don't care about the means by which they arrive there. They also argue that the group is no longer anti-American. It's not. They are American puppets at this point, completely transformed into U.S. proxies. Raymond Tainter, one of the group's supporters in the United States, contends that the MEK and the NCRI are allies for regime change in Tehran and also act as a useful proxy for gathering intelligence. The MEK's greatest intelligence coup was the provision of intelligence in 2002 that led to the discovery of a secret site in Iran for enriching uranium. Despite its defenders' claims, the MEK remains on the U.S. government list of foreign terrorist organizations. They are by no doubt at all a terrorist organization. Regardless of who they are targeting, they are a terrorist organization because of the means they use to target people. In the 1970s, the group killed 3 U.S. officers and 3 civilian contractors in Iran. During the 1979-1980 hostage crisis, the group praised the decision to take American hostages. It was reported that while the group's leaders publicly condemned the 9/11 attacks, within the group celebrations were widespread. Undeniably, the group has conducted terrorist attacks, often excused by the MEK's advocates because they are directed against the Iranian government. For example, in 1981, the group bombed the headquarters of the Islamic Republic Party, which was then the clerical leadership's main political organization, killing an estimated 70 senior officials. More recently, the group has claimed credit for over a dozen mortar attacks, assassinations, and other assaults on Iranian civilian and military targets between 1998 and 2001. At the very least, to work more closely with the group, at least in an overt manner, Washington would need to remove it from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. And that was in 2009. By 2012, that is exactly what the United States would do right here. Reuters, 2012, U.S. to drop Iranian MEK group from terrorist list. Officials. And this was solely to use this terrorist group. It began as a terrorist group. Its entire existence, it has been a terrorist group. It is still a terrorist group. It is being sponsored by the U.S. specifically because now it is willing to conduct terrorism against the Iranian people and the Iranian government. So after providing all of this information to you using only Western sources, the Western media, Western think tanks funded by Western governments and corporations and financial institutions, you can clearly see that what's going on in Iran right now has nothing to do with social justice, has nothing to do with women's rights. The US itself is hypocritical at best on these issues. That is all a smokescreen behind which the US is pursuing regime change against Iran solely because it is an ally of Russia, is also very close with China, and most importantly, it is an obstacle to US hegemony over the region, the Middle East, and also hegemony over the world. So this is the kind of corner the US has painted itself into. They're whining about these referendums being held in southern and eastern Ukraine, all while blatantly violating the sovereignty of Iran, backing violent terrorist organizations trying to overthrow the government of Iran. And one more point I want to make about this 2009 Brookings institution paper, Which Path to Persia. There were other options mentioned in it. I have talked about making a deal with Iran. They talk about that in the paper, and they talk about how nobody in the world is going to support a unilateral U.S. assault on military attack on Iran. They have to try to make it look like the U.S. attempted by all means to avoid a military confrontation. So they suggested making a deal, essentially sabotaging it, blaming Iran for it failing, and then using that as a pretext to escalate. And what did they do? They pretended to implement the Iranian nuclear deal. This was under Obama. Under Trump, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew. Under Biden now, so 3 different U.S. presidential administrations, he is citing this as a pretext to escalate against Iran. And right now, literally, the U.S. is trying to overthrow the Iranian government by sponsoring violent uprisings. So this is a demonstration of the continuity of agenda that drives U.S. foreign policy. It does not matter who is in the White House. It does not matter who you vote in Congress. As long as these unelected interests control Wall Street, they control Washington, and they control the outcome of U.S. foreign policy and also domestic policy. So let's keep an eye on this situation in Iran. This isn't the first time this has happened. Iran has faced down multiple attempts by the U.S. to foment violent subversion in their country. It can get very messy, but ultimately Iran usually prevails. But I just want people to understand that that is what they are seeing. This is U.S.-sponsored meddling and violent subversion in Iran. This is not organic or spontaneous. The idea that this is about women's rights or social justice, that is just a smokescreen. The U.S. is advancing its foreign policy behind. And again, as I try to explain to people, if they understand they're being lied to about Ukraine by Western governments and the Western media, Iran is not the first thing they're telling the truth about. And I just proved with evidence that that is the case, that they are also lying about Iran. They're also lying about China. And I've spent years writing articles and producing videos, drawing together evidence just as compelling to make that point as well. So we need to keep all of this in mind when we're looking at Western headlines and trying to figure out what's really going on versus what we're being told is going on. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram, a social media platform outside of the West's ability to censor it. I use that as an alternative for Twitter and Facebook. I update it several times a day. All of my videos on YouTube are automatically backed up on Rumble and Odyssey. It might take a day or two, but they always end up there as well. Also, please be patient if you're waiting for closed captions. YouTube automatically generates them, and it could take a day or more for them to show up, but eventually they will. And the video description below, I've put the links in for all of these articles and documents that I've referenced in this video. There are also ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If you see an ad pop up, please feel free to skip it because it's not doing me any good. If you want to support my work, you can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also PayPal. And to everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. I could not do this without that support. So again, thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.